Sounds great. It was so great to hear from Derek too. It's actually our first time meeting, so exciting to hear about your project. Yeah, so I graduated in painting in 2019 and also with a minor in theory and history of art and design. So my proposed project for Fulbright was searching for figurative representations of women in Korean art. And just to also say as a note that I am Korean American. And so I think when I was initially thinking about what country I wanted to go to as my host country, I was pretty clear from the start that I was interested in Korea. And at the bottom, you'll note that I was technically part of the 2019 cohort, but because of COVID, I was in Korea from 2020 to 2021. And so the timeline had been adjusted, and I was supposed to go August 2019, but I ended up going February 2020. And so there was a bit of, I wouldn't say problem, but the COVID pandemic definitely affected much of my grant even while I was in the country. And just to talk a little bit about timeline, because I think a lot of people are curious about the process of application. I think I went to my first info session when I was a sophomore, and then I kind of had that ideation that I wanted to, it would be a dream to get this kind of funding to be able to pursue my own research. And so I first started my application attempt the summer before going into junior year. And I think I got maybe about halfway through the first draft with Lisa. And then I realized that it was a bit much at the time for me. And so I shelved it, went through the semester, and then later, the summer before my senior year, reopened that draft, which I think was quite helpful to have the first attempt because I had already started looking into the country requirements. And likewise, Lisa and Derek mentioned this earlier too. Each country is going to have different language requirements. And Lisa had mentioned to me previously that for Korea, the language requirements fluctuate. So sometimes it was showing up as beginner level is acceptable, and other times it was showing up as intermediate is required. And so I had at Brown as a senior started taking Korean classes not only for the objective of meeting language requirements potentially for Fulbright, but just because I was interested as well personally in increasing my fluency. And in terms of affiliations, I do want to speak mostly about this because I think that reaching out to your affiliations, creating affiliations is one of the most hardest parts of the grants, but also one of the most rewarding and fulfilling parts of the application process. And I knew that I wanted to have one affiliate that was aligned with the institution, not only because that's a requirement, but because I'm interested in art history, but also wanted to have a artist, working artist affiliate. And things actually ended up aligning quite well. I did have initial struggle, I would say, in July, August of cold emailing about 10, 15 people and reaching out. And of course, the replies varied. Some people didn't reply at all, and others were unsure even what Fulbright was or what kind of project I was interested in. And so I think just some advice that I can give in the affiliation stage is that you shouldn't be surprised if somebody, the person that you're reaching out to, doesn't know what Fulbright is, and don't be discouraged. I think oftentimes it's very assumptive to, think that your affiliate knows exactly what the program that you're trying to pursue is. So just a reminder to not be discouraged about that. But I cold emailed this artist who ended up being my secondary affiliate named Yoon Sung Nam. And while I was reaching out to several galleries and institutions, I had reached out to her gallery that she's represented by in Korea. And they let me know that she was going to be in Washington, D.C. for the first time at the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery and having her first US museum show. And because this artist is actually in her 80s and our email communication was limited, I just had the feeling that if I had the chance to go meet her, it would be better to get my letter of affiliation signed in person. So I actually did have the chance to go to Washington, D.C. just for a few days and see her talk and see her work in person, and then also get the letter of affiliation signed in person, which was really wonderful. So this is her giving her talk at the National Portrait Museum. And this is us together. And on the right side is her colleague and also another professor named Hyunju Kim, who works in the field related to art history, but also very closely with this artist herself. And likewise, my first affiliate to go back was an institutional affiliation at a Korean university. And I was able to meet this professor who was a art history and theory critical studies professor of Korean art by reaching out to a other Korean professor who actually was studying in apparel studies, but she had presented at Brown University. And so I had remembered that connection. And then I kind of on a um, going out on a limb, I asked her if she had any recommendations for me, and she connected me with her colleague. And again, this was kind of in really good alignment at the time that Professor Chung was publishing and editing collaboratively this book, which is called Korean Art, Collision, Innovation, and Interaction, which is one of, I would say, the only comprehensive English books about the total like contemporary Korean art history. And so this book ended up being something that also really informed my grant and studies while I was in Korea and taking and auditing her PhD classes. And so unfortunately, one part of COVID that really affected my grant was not being able to go into the classes in person. So we were meeting on Zoom, and then I did have the chance to meet some of my classmates individually, but it wasn't quite the in-person connection that I had dreamed about and wrote about in my grant. So in terms of community engagement too, even though I had proposed a lot more community engagement with the university itself, a lot of that didn't end up coming into fruition. And this is going back to the secondary affiliate, the artist Yoon Sung Nam. Right after I arrived to Korea, I immediately went into a 2-week quarantine. And then right after the quarantine, I was able to catch her solo exhibition at Hakgoje Gallery, which is the gallery that had initially told me that she was going to be in the United States. And so this is us meeting again for the second time, me going to see her solo show. So these are some examples of the work. And initially, I was thinking that, of course, I wanted to go to Korea just to learn about my own history and experience being in Korea itself as somebody who is a member of the Korean diaspora. But I had some really great advice from a trusted professor who reminded me that it's really important to have a tight kind of elevator pitch about what I want to be studying specifically. So it wasn't quite enough in terms of being convincing for a grant project to just say that I wanted to study my diasporic history, but to really narrow in. So even though the scope of my interest was much larger than just learning about figurative representations of women, packaging it in that way, I think really helped me narrow in on my interests for what I wanted to do during the grant year and narrow in on the affiliates that I wanted to choose. And so these are some examples of Yoon Sung Nam's work. And just to give some context, she is still working as an artist now, but she began her arts career really late, you could say, in her 40s. I'm going to say traditionally later. And so this is us again when I visited her studio in Korea as well, again with Professor Kim, who I met in Washington, D.C. And so even though a lot of my grant activities were limited because of the pandemic, one of the most wonderful parts of the grant was being able to go visit the artist studio in person and just hear about her life as an artist. And her history, so much of it is the living history of being in Korea as well. And so that was really formative to my grant. And these are more images of her studio. This is the upper level of her studio where she archives a lot of her earlier works as well. And again, some of her other self-portraiture works. And so additionally, a big part of my research interest while being in Korea was to continue my pursuit of becoming more fluent in Korean. So thankfully we did have a language stipend available to us. So I was able to use that stipend to get one-on-one lessons in Korean and really improve my fluency. So even now, of course, I'm not like 100% bilingual, but it's a lot better than it was when I initially first started the grant. And so really being in the country and experiencing day-to-day life and having to navigate, I think was really influential to my practice as well. These are some of the more traditional Korean pigments that Yoon Sung-nam uses in her practice. And so in mentioning kind of specificity to your host country, I was also proposing that I wanted to study more traditional Korean mediums because I had felt that my art history exposure was mostly centered around a Western and Euro and US centric canon, and that goes material wise too. So my education at RISD was mostly centered around oil painting, but a big push for me and reasoning for me to be in Korea and specifically learn from this artist was not only her figurative representations of women, but also her use of more traditional materials. This is an image of my studio that I had while in Korea. And initially, I had tried to propose to have a studio in the university itself, but that didn't end up working out just because the students at the time also had very limited studio spaces. So I did have to pursue looking for my own studio space, which thankfully there were some RISD alumni around in Korea who were working as artists. So I reached out to them to inquire about how to go about looking for a studio space. But thankfully, the studio space was right in front of the university. So the few times that I did go to the university, I was able to be in close proximity. This is an example of one of the works that I made during the grant. And actually, it's interesting because while I came to study figurative representations, as to inform my practice better. Now that I have continued to study that, I'm actually more taking a step back from figurative representations because I realized that from a diasporic lens, that might be more relevant than for artists who are currently in Korea because they are seeing themselves represented in the more mainstream media. And as a kind of culmination of the grant too, I was able to connect with a different diasporic artist who I overlapped with in Korea. And we had a two-person show together that was actually curated by another RISD student at the time who was passing through Korea for the summer. And so that was kind of a really lovely way to be in community with a new friend and also old members of a RISD community. And the friend on the right side is also a RISD painting colleague. So she had graduated at this point and then returned to Korea. And so she was able to come to my show. And just to kind of loop things around to where I am currently. So I'm actually still in Korea post-grant, although that wasn't the intention initially. So if you can see some of the background of this work, it's actually the Korean homework that I was doing during the grant year. And so still the grant has continued to inform so much of my practice now. And of course, I'm still in Korea. So living here and really being able to immerse myself in the art scene more long term has been great as an extension of the grant.